Chapter 5, Trinity Clocks. From a place in prehistory, people have marked time. Peoples have marked time, from monoliths and stone circles, to water clocks and sticks in the ground. Alfred the Great tried to find candles that burned for a whole day and night with which to mark hour upon hour. And poor craftsmen with genius have crafted chronometers that found longitude, well, one, only for to be stolen by the Royal Navy. Thomas Barrow knew all there was to know about clocks. Clocks and butlering both relied on precision and timing. One relied on the specific manufacture of cogs and springs. What he knew, and what his brother knew, they passed on to Thomas's adopted son, his wife's son, Ernest, who relished the knowledge, became expert, and branched out into jewelry so fine that Fabberg himself would have wept. Oh yes, your father completed his degree, and was on for further research work at Manchester. Larry picked up the horse's leg and wiped it over. It had been a damp end of August and his young niece had brought over a pie sent by his sister, made at Downton, probably the end of a batch or one guests hadn't requested. Janet was swinging on the fence, watching him. But then, he came back here. Always here. Because of his mother? My grandmother? Did you know her? Larry turned from the horse and took two big strides towards her. He looked like their grandfather. Christopher had often remarked how much both Larry and their mother Flora looked like Grandad Andy. Janet had seen a picture of him as a young man, standing beside Daisy after they had married. Where Andy's hair now curled white, Larry's was near identical. Even wearing the DA haircut that had been popular in the 50s and he hadn't changed in nearly 20 years. I met her, for a short time. He breathed, as if remembering a time long ago. But, Thomas has told you? He told you and Christopher. Yes, agreed Janet. But their father had barely anything to say on the subject. He was home, and that was where he had wanted to say. Somehow, even Master George, Georgie's father, had managed to get Ernest out of national service. And he had lived his life, from age 13, apart from those years at Manchester, at Downton, in the Ashby cottage. What you need to know about your father, is he came looking for your grandmother, Larry continued. He was 13, younger than you are now, on his own, with money he had stolen from his adopted family's home. They had been killed in a bombing raid, and clothes from another wrecked house. He stowed all the way over from Europe, just to find her. He is happy here, and doesn't like to talk about the war. Mum said, Janet added, a little bashfully. Why the sudden interest? I found a book, and a letter, or something, that she had written at the Ashby cottage. It said, Downton Abbey on the label in the book, so I took it back to Master Georgie, that is, the Lord Grantham. It was of Irish poetry. But I kept the letter. Look. Wiping his hands on his trousers, Larry Parker put out a big hand and reached for the letter that his niece was holding. It was crinkled, yellow with age, curled at the corners. From its folds fell some seeds. Janet stooped down to collect them up from the hard earth and put them into her trouser pocket. What's them? Larry asked, then remembered his speech for butlering. Or rather, what are those? From the trees in the dower garden, Janet said, sadly. They were cut down, now the new development is going on. She stood up on one of the slats of the fence, leaning over to look where her uncle was looking. To find the one after the one must search west more than east, and look for fairer flowers than the holly. 3 of 3 makes 9. He turned to Janet. What do you suppose that means? I don't know. Do you know if it was Milo's? Melusina's? Larry took a few steps towards her and rested an arm on the fence, glancing over the untidy writing again. I only knew her for a few days, a week, perhaps, he told Janet, looking between the letter and his niece's face. She was ill. Wasn't she? Mother told me how she had been captured in the war, and tortured, but had escaped and got here eventually. What did you know of her? Her work killed her, didn't it? Larry smiled, and folded up the letter, pressing it into Janet's hand. You should ask your father, or Thomas, about Milo, he told her, with the kind of brightness that an adult uses when they mean the conversation is at an end. But, I will say this, I have never seen a braver person. How she stood between Mr. Branson and your father, saved his life when fired the pistol. When Janet's mind, still with thought, was suddenly lit up at new knowledge of her family. She had never heard that before. "Please, Uncle Larry, Mother tells me to ask my father, who doesn't say very much, but tells me to speak to Grandad Thomas." I thought she had died because of her injuries, but she was shot. "Speak to your father," Larry told her, using his butler tone of voice, conveying steadiness and calmness despite how he felt. They were there, all were there, Lady Mary included, and he looked down into his niece's hands. Janet was playing with something. "Where did you get that?" "I found it. Look." She put her hand out towards Larry, and dropped the unusually heavy object into his hands. It was a box, and it contained a medal of some kid. "Do you know what it is?" Janet pressed. "Now, here," Larry thought. Ernest wouldn't have told her anything and Thomas would have become angry. Whatever anyone might say, Janet Ashby Barrow was sharp about some things. And being dreamy was no bad thing. She was thoughtful, but directionless, so Florrie had said. She had no talent for cooking, but did take an interest in the farm. So many times she was standing at a fence, watching him manage the cows or lend a hand at lambing time. Their farm, their mother Daisy's inheritance from Mr. Mason. "I have seen nothing like it before," Larry admitted. It was heavy, like lead, but with a green-grey tinge to it. "Put it back, from wherever you got it," he said, suddenly, closing the lid on the box. "You won't say anything to Thomas and neither will I." Larry Parker watched as his niece placed the box in her jacket pocket. "Exactly where you got it from." "And father?" "Janet, your father does not like being reminded he is as German as he is English," Larry told her, hoping later that Janet would forget the significance of his words. "But," he leaned closer, "there is nothing stopping you from finding out about her. She wired Downton with her brother, Ernest. She invented all manner of electrical items that Mother used when she was kitchen maid. There is nothing to stop you." A smile crept over Janet's face, as she took the letter back from her uncle's hand. "Thank you, Uncle Larry. I always knew you were the best. You, and the farm." "Oh, well," Larry replied, nodding. "Good, little Janet. I look forward to reading all about me Lucina Ashby, when you've written her biography." This made Janet Barrow smile even more. "I will, Uncle Larry," she called as she turned and began to run across the field that headed back towards Downton Village. "I will." 88,888,888 2nd of April, 1945. Bag, wake up, you lazy man. Milo Ashby, having trod with weariness towards the church and unlocked the gates that night, had now reversed the process as if a dragon was on her heels. Which well it might be, if her calculations were correct. She had repositioned the lines of dangling uranium cuboids. That should be enough for criticality. It was a question of radius. The deuterated water should work then. It had come to her in the early hours of the morning when, instead of returning back to her room at the beer cellar, as was expected of her, she remained in the basement of the monastery. In the dim light of the evening she began with a calculation, and had woken to find her pencil had drawn a line through her arithmetic. It needed to be checked. And for that, she needed Eric Bagg to get to his feet and run the last distance. "Bagg!" Milo shouted again, shaking the man by the shoulder, ignoring the protocol that the older physicists, Hartek, Hahn and even Die Ebner, insist she follow. "Stand up out of your bed. This is not an emergency." "Not an emergency," the young researcher replied, wiping the back of his hand across his eyes. He was a likable young man who slept like a log and was always the last up even on sunny mornings, which that day was shaping up to be. "Ashby, lays with the pile we have ... we have ... Come on, Bagg, get up. We need you." But with one moment, Eric Bagg had turned over, and was snoring again. Milo glanced around. Others were still asleep, and she knew she had to be as quiet as possible. Peter Debye was the man with the contact on the other side, but she didn't want him to know quite yet. Milo had to be sure, so she shook Bagg's shoulder again. "No." Milo shook her head, pushing the man's shoulder, this time her tone changing to one of subdued concern. "No, please Bagg, I need to be sure. Carl Friedrich will suppress it. Han will shout, let it be our secret. Just for a moment. It worked, and the physicist, 8 years her junior, slowly inched up his sheet and blanket. And you wish me to check your calculations? He asked, with the slowness of one that sleep hasn't quite left. I wish you to check my calculations, and then when we are sure. Eric Bagg took Milo's wrist gently, and looked at her with silent clarity, his blue eyes on her own. What do you believe has happened? Criticality. With a jolt, Eric Bagg sat up in bed, still in his vest and long johns. Milo would normally wait for them to come down from the loft of the stable where the single men working on the machine slept. But this time, she merely backed away, poised to accost him again if he got back into bed. Han, Bagg muttered, pulling on his trousers. He had got back late with Die Ebner and Hartek. They had been drinking. He rubbed his head. Frau Kellner has the breakfast on, maybe coffee? She asked, encouragingly. It's what they call coffee, Ashby, he scoffed. Look, I'll come, but... He turned his head to her in incredulity, criticality? Yes, Milo confirmed. The closed her mouth tight shut as a snort of a person being disturbed from sleep caught her attention. She didn't want any of the others, and HB was away with his family again. It had been Bagg who had been there for her when Han had stood over her shouting when he had found her in the cave beneath the monastery crying. There had been news of a bombing raid, one like countless others. They were far enough away that the machine risked far less of a direct hit thank on Berlin. But up on the top of the mountains Stuttgart was burning. You are a fool. A stupid English fool of a girl. But Carl Friedrich, the diplomat's son, had cautioned Han by speaking English to Milo. So he switched to German. How is it that one moment you can calculate acceleration data and projected power output in a minute and the next, you sob like a child over this? Han had thrown a hand derisively in the direction of the aflame German city. He had tutted and walked away. But Eric Bagg, round glasses and concerned face, had put a gentle hand on her shoulder. The youngest child of 8, 7 older sisters had taught him that emotions came and went, and friendly word went a long way. So he was beside her in the cavern within 10 minutes of Milo awakening him, and had climbed clumsily down the ladder that took them from the monastery's outer level as Milo waited for him. Having nimbly traversed the rock face. 88,888,888 they had gone to the Black Forest last winter, though Milo had not wanted to leave the machine. It had been in Weisseckers and Bagg's company that she had played cards and laughed. They had welcomed her as equals, and even Han had accepted her that winter, in the safety of the wilderness. And HB had returned home from that Christmas with another spring in his step. Elizabeth was having yet another baby. It had been then, and only then, that Milo had wanted to tell him of Ernst, that he must be 11 by now, and he had been adopted. They had walked together in the crispness of the winter morning with the Swiss border ahead of them. I would not like them to think we are having a love affair, Milo said, when they had climbed the mountain last time. They don't think anything, HB told her. They dream of fission, and how to make fission happen, because, like you and me, they know the physics is beautiful even when people are despicable. And she was Ashby, amongst them, happy to be far away from Berlin and the horrors that had confronted her there. The war will be over soon, Lublin. Did you send your code, with the message I asked? HB touched her cold cheek with his warm hand, and they were in Göttingen and Berlin, and Leiden and Leipzig again. Yes, Milo replied. It had been the third message she had written, coded as if a pattern, a drawing. It had gone to Debye, the Dutch physicist, so good at being a loyal Nazi Milo almost believed he was one. Then, he would have handed it to a spy, and then it would go to another, the end recipient being Otto Friss, who would tell Max Born, who would write to Both. He was at Cambridge, and he had means of getting the information out to America. This time it was that there was no dragon. Dragon meant uranium, chosen, as it had been, based on the myth of a sleeping dragon in the Czech mountains whence the first uranium had been discovered. Not for the last time, Me Lucina Ashby Barrow allowed Werner Heisenberg to kiss her. 88,888,888. This has not been written yet, nor will it. When Janet Ashby Barrow discovers this slice of Milo's history, she will not experience the camaraderie, the teamwork, the sense of belonging and of hope. Milo was a physicist above all else, as were the men she worked with. Unfortunately, the men she worked with were not based in England, nor were they working for her country. But they were working on uranium and, as such, Milo had been blackmailed into working with them. Because she was not a physicist first, she was a Downtoner, a person loyal to Downton Village and the big house, and the people who had been loyal to her when she was a lost child looking for her place. Let's hope her granddaughter will find all of the pieces and ask all of the right questions before someone else beats her to it.